So good afternoon to all of our participants and welcome to our webinar, Purpose-Driven Board Leadership, Conversations for the Boardroom. My name is Takeda Battle, Director of Corporate and Federated Partnerships at BoardSource, and I'll be serving as your host and moderator for today. BoardSource President and CEO Ann Walsted's most recent article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, entitled The 4 Principles of Purpose-Driven Board Leadership, inspired today's webinar. Next slide, please. Today, we will engage you in a deep conversation about each of the principles of purpose-driven board leadership, host a Q&A with our panelists, and address questions that you may have for you and your board. Don't worry, we've built in way more than enough time for Q&A at the end. If you do have questions, I do ask that you use our question and answer feature below. At this time, I would like to introduce you to our panelists who will lead you through this deep dive. I have with me 3 leaders from BoardSource: Ann Walsted, President and Chief Executive Officer; Jim Taylor, Vice President of Leadership Initiatives; and Andy Davis, Associate Vice President of Member Education and Outreach. Now you will hear from Ann Walsted, who will kick us off. Ann, it's great to be with you today.
Thanks so much, Takeda, and thank you to you all for joining us. We're really excited to be having this conversation with you and look forward to your questions and feedback as we move through this conversation. I want to start just picking up where Takeda left off and acknowledging that today's conversation draws from an article that we released just last month in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And this article really argues that this moment that we are in right now calls for true reinvention of the nonprofit board. And what we hope that the article does is offers a new way of thinking about the board's most essential work, what we are calling purpose-driven board leadership. So today's conversation is really an opportunity for us to engage you and you to engage with us around these principles of purpose-driven board leadership and to answer questions that you have about what a purpose-driven approach to board leadership might mean for your organization and for your board. I want to start by acknowledging that purpose-driven board leadership is not a silver bullet solution to all board challenges, nor is it a new structure or model to be applied rigidly. It is, as we see it, a new way of being for boards, and one that we believe could radically strengthen the way that social sector organizations are governed and led, and ultimately create fundamental shifts in the way that we see our role and our work as a sector. The thinking behind purpose-driven board leadership really centers on a long-held BoardSource belief that boards must be strategic bodies, that boards that deprioritize or undervalue their strategic role and instead focus on narrowly on things like oversight or fundraising are really doing so at the risk of organizational effectiveness and organizational resilience. And it builds on that core belief and argues that for boards to bring relevance, accountability, and integrity to that strategic role, they must have knowledge and insights about the work that the organization does and the community that it seeks to serve. And it acknowledges that, unfortunately, that is just not the reality for many boards today. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So I want to start by just sharing some context, and this comes from the article as well, but it's based on BoardSource's own research through our Leading with Intent study, which will actually be coming out very soon. And there are some key pieces of research that we think are really important and really were context for us in terms of why change was needed. So first, what we see in our research is that unfortunately, many boards are very disconnected from the communities and people that that they serve as an organization. So half, 49% of all chief executives in our study said that they did not have the right board members to establish trust with the communities that they serve. And only a third of boards, 32%, place a high priority on knowledge of the community served, and even fewer, 28%, place a high priority on membership within the community served. And I want to mention, just for those sort of data wonks out there, this question was not a forced ranking, which means that respondents were not limited to only one high priority area. They could have selected high priority for all of the criteria listed. So it's especially telling when CEOs are reporting or executive directors are reporting that something is of lower importance. The next kind of category, which you see up on your slide already here, is that boards are unfortunately somewhat ill-informed about the ecosystems in which their organizations are operating. So when we ask questions about, the knowledge of the organization's work or field or experience with similar organizations or mission areas, we saw, relatively low frequency of chief executives and ED saying that their boards were bringing that to their perspectives on the board. Next, we saw that boards are, so we can go ahead and advance to that next bullet, are lacking in racial and ethnic diversity. So not only are boards overwhelmingly white, 78% of board members are white and 19% of boards are all white, but boards lacking in racial and ethnic diversity self-report, meaning they're saying this themselves about themselves, that their board's racial and ethnic makeup is negatively impacting their ability to understand the organization's operating environment and work, that it is negatively impacting their ability to attract and retain talent for both the board and the staff, that it's negatively impacting their standing with funders, donors, and the general public, that it is challenging their ability to understand how best to serve the community. And I think most importantly, or, from my perspective, very, very importantly, it is impeding their ability to cultivate trust and confidence with the community that they serve. And then finally, as a category, we see that there is evidence that many boards are preoccupied with fundraising above all else. So that's not to say that the fundraising role of the board isn't important. We believe that it is. But when it is prioritized above all other things, there are some real risks that are created in terms of what the board is set up to do and what the board is not set up to do. So when asked how important the board's performance is across 18 areas of board responsibility, 70% of chief executives rated fundraising as very important, and that was above most other categories of board performance, including thinking strategically as a board, setting the strategic direction of the organization, knowledge of organizational programs, and understanding of the context in which the organization is working. 4 areas that, particularly when you consider those other findings, are really, really deep existential threats in terms of the board's ability to lead strategy in a way that is relevant, authentic, and responsive to community needs. So we at BoardSource really reflected on, not only these most recent findings, but what we've been seeing over years and years of work with nonprofit boards. And I don't want to in any way sound like we are not on the side of boards. We are huge believers in boards, and we know that boards are working earnestly and diligently to do good work for their communities and for their organizations. But the reality is these findings tell us that there is change that is needed. And we started reflecting on, well, what would be a better way? What would be a way forward that would better position boards to really operate in a way that puts their organization's purpose and the people that they serve first? And that was the genesis for our thinking around purpose-driven board leadership. So I want to start by saying that this is a philosophical versus a structural shift. And we're going to talk about 4 principles of purpose-driven board board leadership. But before we get into those 4 principles, just generally, this philosophy around purpose-driven board leadership acknowledges, as we've just been talking about, that there are serious and significant challenges at the board level that we believe stem from a breakdown between, and we can advance through these bullets, what the board understands its role to be. So as we talked about, those boards that are prioritizing oversight or fundraising or both above the strategic role, that fundamentally shapes the way that the board understands its role, that it thinks about its role. That then in turn impacts how the board populates itself. So what the board understands its role to be flows into or impacts who the board recruits in alignment with that role. And who the board recruits or how the board is populated then informs how the board prioritizes and makes decisions for the organization. And so we argue in the article that there is a direct connection between the what, the who, and the how of boards, and that we are not in the place that we could be in terms of the relationship between those 3. And it offers a new way of thinking. We offer a new way of thinking about the board's role and the way that it approaches its work, which also we believe includes necessary shifts to board composition and practices. And it's organized, as I said before, around 4 key principles of purpose-driven board leadership. So I'm going to give you just a thumbnail sketch of those 4 principles, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Andy and Jim, to talk a little bit more about what each of those 4 principles really means. Once they've shared a bit more context on those 4, then we'll move into a conversation, and we invite all of your questions and comments as a part of that discussion. So first principle, we term purpose before organization. So that's really about the prioritization of an organization's purpose versus the organization itself. The second principle is respect for ecosystem, and that's an acknowledgement that an organization's actions or inactions can positively or negatively impact its surrounding ecosystem, and that a commitment to being a respectful and responsible ecosystem player is important for social sector organizations to prioritize. The third principle is equity mindset. And that is a belief that a commitment to advancing equitable outcomes and interrogating and avoiding the ways in which organizational strategies and work can actually reinforce systemic inequities. And then finally, authorized voice and power, the recognition that organizational power and voice must be authorized by those impacted by the organization's work. So let me pause there. There's lots more to talk about, but I'm going to hand it over to Andy, who's going to walk us through those first 2 principles.
Thanks, Ann. And hey, everybody, it's always awesome to be with you all. I hope that you are having a great day. I hope it is as beautiful wherever you are today as it is here in Washington, D.C. As a matter of fact, while Ann was talking, I had a cardinal land right here, just in my eyesight on our balcony outdoors. So forgive me if I make this little guy my audience and not you folks on the call. But the Cardinal's going to learn a lot about purpose-driven board leadership. So let's start with this, purpose first. And what does that really mean? So for as long as I've been working with nonprofit boards, and from everything I've learned about historical context, boards are supposed to be mission-driven, right? Which basically means that the board needed to make sure that programs and activities of the nonprofit were aligned with what it said it cared about. But when we talk about purpose-driven leadership, we're saying that instead of focusing solely on the organization's role in doing good, perhaps we can shift that frame to, instead of just doing good, why does the organization actually exist? And I know when Ann and I started to have discussions about this topic, and all of us on this call had in-depth discussions. And I remember, Ann and I had one-on-ones. Jim and I talked about it back in our office, and it started, with other folks who were at BoardSource at the time. This was kind of a hard piece for me to grasp. And I thought, when we talked about purpose instead of mission, because I came up in the nonprofit sector like probably all of you did on the call, thinking that mission was my guiding star. And it broke my brain a little bit to think that there was something else that was more important even. And so I asked Ian, I remember saying, what does that even mean? So let's talk about what does it mean? Because it's actually a pretty significant shift. Traditionally, everything we focus on the board and the organization has centered the organization in the middle of the board's universe. But what if we flip it, right? And we say that our purpose is more important than our organization? Then we can start getting the organization out of the way for doing our most good. So let me try to center this on some common principles that we've all talked about and we know, which are, vision and mission. We talk about those terms all the time. And vision is our desired future state. And mission is an organization's role in working towards its vision. If you've ever heard me speak before, I use this analogy a lot. But your mission is what I've referred to as your yellow brick road. Your vision is kind of the Emerald City, where you're going, what you're trying to get to. And then we kind of throw values into the mix, or not kind of, we do throw our values into the mix. And we say that these are the principles and beliefs that guide how we enact this work that we're doing. Well, if we took it one step further, and again, all these folks in our office led by Ann had really deep conversations on how all of this works together. And purpose is an organization's reason for being in the world. And it is a melding of those concepts of your mission and values in pursuit of that vision. So does that make sense? Let me say that one more time. An organization, your reasons for being in the world is your purpose. And it's really a melding of your mission and values in pursuit of your vision. So when an organization's purpose really may be served by something that does not directly or indirectly serve the organization or even works against it, that distinction becomes a little bit more clear between how we view a traditional board role and what the difference is between a purpose-driven board. And that kind of becomes, like I said, much more clear when you have those difficult conversations. So the traditional framing used to be that boards operate in service to an organization and that they are seeking to advance the public good. And the board is primarily responsible for sustaining and supporting the organization and its ability to exist in service to the mission. And that's great, but what if we started talking about it this way? Because like I said, we can see how that, if we're operating in service to the organization, it can get in the way of our purpose. But a purpose-driven board would ask, or say, when the board operates in service to the organization's purpose, the board is primarily responsible for stewarding all of those organizational resources and capacities to maximize positive impact. Well, again, under these great conversations that we had in the office and how we kind of tore this apart and we thought with it and we thought about it and really were thinking differently. My first thought here was, well, what about those three legal duties, right? We all know the three legal duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. And what are those as fiduciaries of an organization, as the responsibility of board members? I've always thought that those are the things that we can only take the duty of care, loyalty, and obedience in context of the organization, meaning that our loyalty here would be to an institution, not those that we serve. And when it made clear that it was this entity that we were building this entire foundation off of, not the people we serve, that seemed incorrect to me. Because we don't serve an organization or an entity. We serve the communities that we operate in and the people that we operate for. And so why would we ever put entity above that? Because you and I both know what might be best for our community is not always best for our organization. So when we talk about this, and Ann used this example in her article, and when we take questions, we're happy to kind of try to give other examples and talk about this. But for the case that this was in the article, I want to stay clear here. But consider an organization that's working on a public health initiative to try to help educate communities about vaccines. We know that this is probably our #1 priority as a country right now to move past COVID, and what's happening is trying to educate folks about vaccines. So if focus groups came back and showed us that our organizational name or logo confuse the public or take away from our key messages, that could be a problem. And of course, the staff and everybody who poured their heart into working on a campaign would be disappointed to know that it's not working. And that changing ads would create additional cost, and it would remove those positive aspects that the staff came up with to share their message. And if the staff were to bring the question to the board, a purpose-driven board would look through this and say, is this conversation about budget and organizational resources, or are we having a conversation that's going to best enable our organization to advance its core purpose? And on top of that, will it allow organizational benefits of brand recognition to get in the way of doing what's best for the community that we serve? So like you see on the screen here, a traditional board would ask, what is best for our organization? And a purpose-driven board asks, what is best for that desired outcome that we seek? And so let's go to the next slide here. And this is where we talk about the second principle, which is a respect for ecosystem. So now that you know how we view who the board is responsible to or for, we have to discuss how the organization operates, because that matters. If we're going to be focused on purpose and the communities we represent and operate in service to, then we have to understand that we can't operate in good faith unless the board and the organization is respecting the ecosystem that we operate within and we're a member of. We know from our research that Ann just shared with you that boards are often not focused on, the environment that they are a part of or who else is operating with them. And I'd argue that that's a product of our organizational first thinking. And what do we look for when we look for board members? I mean, I think that the first answer here is probably wealth or access to resources, but it's also that we always look for kind of technical expertise related to the programs we provide or what the organization needs, not in-depth knowledge about how we work or where we work or how we operate. And the secret, it's not a secret, it's well-known fact about board members is that they want to do a great job. Board members are in the boardroom because they want to help this organization. They crave doing the best job they possibly can. But the problem is we signal to them when we recruit this way that we want them to do their day jobs in the board, that we are bringing in for this technical expertise. And when they try to do that, it can lead to a ton of problems because that lens that we've asked for their technical expertise, it comes in all discussions, and then they lack awareness or curiosity about the environment that the organization is operating within. So what do we do as organizations or as boards to address this lack of insight? Well, we give board members increased exposure to programs, or we have them kind of shadow staff to see how we're connecting with our communities, but that's not enough, right? And it's great that we're well-intentioned, but it's not enough because it doesn't provide true perspective. And perspective is so difficult when boards don't have intimate knowledge of the other players in our environment, who they are or who else is part of our broader collective. And just like nature, when one piece of our ecosystem breaks down, it has a rippling effect for the rest of our environment. I don't know what you've done throughout the last year in quarantine, but I've watched a ton of Sir David Attenborough and his Planet Earth, and I know and understand that ecosystems are super delicate. I've learned a lot about the importance of bees, in the last year and a half. But also, it's not just these smaller players that build up. You can't grow your way out of an ecosystem or that ecosystem interdependence. Even apex predators have a role to play within an ecosystem. So wherever your place is, there are individuals and there are entities who are impacted by the work you do and how you do it. And in our goal to achieve purpose, not grow our organizations, we are part and parcel of that entire ecosystem. So what does that really mean? So, back to Ann's example, this might look like an organization that's looking for a new location for its physical programs. So think about what a board conversation around that would look like. They might identify a great site based on all the criteria the organization says it needs, but it is also what if that site is also in close proximity to another organization? Well, if you are the larger and better resource of the two organizations, moving that space could create a real challenge for the other organization nearby to hold on to program participants and funders and all of the things that have helped it serve its community. A purpose-driven board is going to ask, how do we understand what this disruption could cause for other organizations, and start thinking about, would this location create the best outcome, not for our organization again, but for our entire overall ecosystem? So back to the slide, a traditional board would ask, how does this impact our organization? And a purpose-driven board asks, how would this impact all of the players and dynamics within our ecosystem? Will it help us as an ecosystem do the most good, be the most healthy, support us all? And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Jim here to talk about equity mindset and community-driven purpose and voice. Oh, and Anne's got her hand.
I've got my hand up, sorry. I know we're going to move to Q&A, but I noticed that we had a question about what ecosystem really means. And I'm wondering if we can talk about that for a second here before we move on. Andy, do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I can start. And I don't want to, I don't know when the question came in. So I don't know if it was before I went back to this piece, but when we talk about, I think the nature example is a good one, but also, think about, I'll just use my neighborhood as an example during the last year of pandemic. I live in kind of a central business district area of downtown Washington, D.C. There are, I live next to the arena, I live next to theaters, I live next to museums. Well, think about when one of these aspects of my neighborhood breaks down, which is 20,000 people a night coming to an arena, and how that ripples across our entire community here. Folks aren't going to bars and restaurants. Folks aren't in their offices to go, grab lunch. So what happens then? Then folks have to start laying off employees, businesses start closing, tax revenue drops for the entire, community, city, neighborhood. And then that has longer lasting impacts and ripple effects. So when we talk about ecosystem, just like in nature, we are talking about a nonprofit's ability to think about how it uses its organizational resources to either share power or consume power, and what that does to other individual organizations, but also individuals that those organizations serve within our communities. But I would love to hear somebody else's take on it as well.
Yeah, I would just add super quickly that there are some linguistic cues about the types of systems that we would name, and this is not an all-inclusive list, but that we would name as important dynamics in ecosystem. So you hear the term competitive landscape, funding environment, public policy environment. Those are three key aspects of ecosystem. Certainly there are others, but all of the sort of systems and contexts that inform and are informed by the work that you do as an organization.
So hopefully that answers it. If it didn't, feel free to throw a more clarifying question in the comments, and we'll grab it when we wrap up here. But Jim, turning it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Andy. Now that Andy has taken us through a deep dive into purpose first and respect for ecosystem, let's talk about the third principle of purpose-driven board leadership, which is an equity mindset. As we all know very well right now, we're living in a moment where the topic of equity is really at the top of the national conversation. It's really the center of the national conversation, especially as it relates to racial equity in this moment. Boards with an equity mindset are grappling with what equity means to them, what it means to their work, what it means to their mission. And they are exhibiting a commitment to advancing equitable outcomes and really interrogating and questioning and avoiding the ways in which the organization's strategies and work might unintentionally reinforce systemic inequities rather than reduce them. Boards with an equity mindset should be applying an equity mindset in several areas, including allocating the organization's resources in a way that is equitable, making sure that they're providing programmatic oversight that can capture disparate impacts based on race or other demographics. And in doing that, they may have to actually disaggregate some of the data to really uncover what's really happening with their programs. And then creating a diverse and inclusive board composition. Boards that are diverse in areas such as their racial and ethnic diversity, their diversity of skill sets, diversity of areas of expertise, diversity of lived experiences of board members, and also access to various networks that board members may bring. So when we think about what this means in the context of an actual scenario, and before we go to that, I just want to add one other comment around inclusive board compositions. When boards are inclusive, they have a culture of trust, they have a culture of respect and candor. Every board member feels valued, every board member feels heard. That is what boards should be aspiring to when they think about really what it means to be diverse in their composition and inclusive in the cultures they're creating. Now, for an example of an equity mindset scenario, consider a nonprofit that develops a large and well-funded job development program. And that program is, by all accounts, very effective for white participants, but is achieving very different, less impressive results, less effective results with Black participants. Now, if a board is not employing an equity mindset to its analysis of the situation, it might only focus on the aggregate outcomes. It might decide that, on average, we're serving our program participants at a relatively high level of satisfaction. But as we just noted, having an equity mindset means that the board is utilizing programmatic oversight that disaggregates the data and captures disparate impacts based on race. So in a scenario like this, the board would ask itself just really deep questions about the program. The board would hold itself and the staff accountable for doing some deep listening with those program participants, in this case, Black participants, let's say, who are not seeing the sort of success, not seeing the sort of outcomes that white participants are seeing. And they'd use those inputs from those participants that are not achieving successful outcomes to help the board develop a strategy for change that would make the program's outcomes more equitable. Now, those changes could take very different forms. Those changes could be a program redesign. They might include a programmatic partnership with another organization, or perhaps the most drastic change might be to actually hand over the program, to do a programmatic transfer to another organization that is frankly better suited to run the program in service to the community that's being served. A purpose-driven board would recognize that changes like these would support the prioritization of advancing equity, even if it means taking on a certain amount of risk, or even absorbing a loss to the organization itself. So to sum this up in terms of the difference between the approaches of a traditional board versus a purpose-driven board, the traditional board would ask itself, how will our strategy advance our mission? The purpose-driven board would go deeper than that and ask itself, how could our strategy reinforce systemic inequities? And what are we willing to do to avoid it? Our fourth and final principle to discuss today is the principle of authorized power and voice, which we define as a recognition that organizational power and voice must be authorized by those most impacted by the work that the organization does. Anne spoke earlier about the fact that the boards are too disconnected from the communities they serve, which signals that organizations are not in true partnership with those communities that they're serving. We fundamentally believe that that's not the way it should be. That means that boards have a responsibility to engage directly with those they serve in a way that ensures that organizational decisions are made in the context of a true understanding of the community's assets, its needs, its preferences, and what it aspires for it to be. And it's not just about soliciting that input and giving voice to program participants in order to hear their needs and experiences. It's also about sharing power by ensuring that those individuals with relevant lived experiences are represented and embedded into the board itself with the full array of rights and responsibilities and power that every other board member has. Now, if the board is not willing to share power in this way, if the board is not willing to engage directly with those they serve, then we believe that that board has not truly earned the right, is not truly authorized to lead. So for an authorized power and voice scenario, consider a longstanding community development organization that has served its constituency, largely lower to moderate income people of color, for decades, but is now struggling to serve that constituency in the midst of rapid gentrification that's happening in its community. In this scenario, the board has a responsibility to make and represent organizational decisions to the public and to the key stakeholders in the community, so that it can serve its constituency in this more challenging environment that's emerging due to gentrification. But for the board to be effective and impactful in carrying out those responsibilities, it needs to have included people who are connected to the community, people who have relevant lived experiences within the board's composition. This is the type of board that will create the most effective solutions and action plans and strategies because it has the needs of the community represented in its boardroom. Also a board that, because of its connection to community, will be best positioned to work and partner with the key municipal and civic stakeholders to arrive at the most equitable solutions for the community it serves. More traditional boards that are, as we described earlier, not diverse, not well connected to community, overly focused on fundraising above all else, not well versed in respecting and understanding the ecosystem in which they operate. Those are the boards that will struggle to be effective in this scenario. So to sum this up in terms of the difference between the approaches of a traditional board versus a purpose-driven board, the traditional board asks itself, what do we think is best? And we call out we in this scenario because what we're saying here is the traditional boards will not go through the process of really intentionally reflecting on how who we are informs their perspective. A purpose-driven board will ask itself, are we as a board populated in a way that ensures that our power is held by the community impacted by the organization's work? And are we doing all we can to understand what our programmatic stakeholders are telling us is most important? So that completes our deep dive into each of these 4 principles of purpose-driven board leadership. Overall, we would just say that, as Ann noted earlier, this is the new orientation. This is a reorientation to board service. We're taking boards from moving from a traditional approach where they're operating in service to an organization that seeks to advance the public good, and they're primarily focused on sustaining and supporting that organization, helping that organization to continue to exist, and moving to a more purpose-driven approach where they reorient their focus on purpose in service to the public good, where they are responsible as stewards of the organization's assets and capacities to help maximize the positive impact in service to that core purpose or cause. And so with that, I will now hand it back over to Takeda, who's going to moderate the next part of this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Ann. Great information. Can we advance to the next slide, please? So I wanted to take this opportunity to guest fireside chat Q&A with our panelists today. So I'm just going to deep dive in. I know that there are some questions in the Q&A, so we will definitely get to those. And we also had some submissions during the registration process. So want to kick it off with this question. If nonprofit boards adopted the 4 principles of purpose-driven board leadership, how do you think social sector organizations would be different? And then what do you think would remain unchanged? Open.
Andy, Jim, either of you want to tackle that first?
Sure, I'm happy to. Gosh, there's so many ways I think that social sector organizations would be different if they adopted these 4 principles. One that comes to mind first and foremost as I think about this question is greater acknowledgement and focus on boards' responsibility to advocate. You know, we know from our own research that advocacy is not an area where many boards really particularly excel. But when you think about a respect for the ecosystem, you know, a respect for how the public policy environment impacts your work, impacts the community you serve, I think it really underscores the importance of advocacy as part of the board's roles and responsibilities. And so I think there would be a better sense, boards would have a better sense of the public policy environment, they'd have a better sense of the connection between public policy and their work, and they would be more intentionally focused on advocacy as one of the important roles that they play.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, Jim, and it's hard not, you know, when I think about how social sector organizations would be different or should be different, what would they do different? It's hard for me not to, you know, think of examples of how organizations have operated in a us first environment and created more damage than they did good, right? I remember when I was in college, and folks who have worked with me have heard me talk about this experience, but it impacted my life pretty heavily. We had a hurricane hit our town, and I remember my father was the executive director of the community, the homeless shelter that we lived in, Soup Kitchen Homeless Shelter, and a ton of, thanks to the generosity of folks all over North Carolina, a ton of money poured into my town to help recover from this disaster. And I remember, like father, like son, my father telling me that he was late for a meeting one day. He thought it started at 9, it started at 8:30, whatever it was. But they were talking about how to divvy up kind of this pot of money. And two sisters from the Catholic charity in town were literally saying, when my father walked in, Dan's late, let's take his part of the pie and we'll just split it up between the rest of us. Well, that's funny to think about, these two nuns that were saying, let's just take his money and divide it up for the rest of us. But the way a traditional board framing has been built is exactly that, right? We are, those duties of care, loyalty, and obedience are to our organization. We have to do what's best for us. And when we do what's best for us, even though they both probably had very similar goals, and if you'd have asked those two sisters, they would have said, we love the work that United Community Ministries is doing. We love what is happening over there, but that's not the work we do. But in their mind, theirs was, we have to grow our organization. What we are trying to do the best amount of good, or the most amount of good that we can too. So we will take a bigger part of the pie. We will not share it with others, because it is a dog eat dog environment that all nonprofits have operated within. And I, it's hard not to imagine that this comes from a framing of, nonprofits need to be more business-like, more business-minded. And if they operated more like businesses, they'd be more successful. Well, businesses don't have an obligation to the community or the ecosystem they serve in the way that nonprofits do, for a variety of reasons. And so when I think about how a nonprofit would operate differently, it is all the things that we've just talked about how shifting the framing of a conversation from how can we do the most good to how can the ecosystem be its healthiest is a very different shift in framing, and one that I think, just short conversations can move the needle a long way.
Yeah, I would echo everything that you've said. And at the risk of oversimplifying, there are two words that really come to mind in terms of what would be different from my perspective. One is connection. I think we will see each other as connected in a way that is really powerful and helpful. And that is both in terms of, fellow organizations within the social sector, between the social sector and other sectors, and between organizations and the people and communities that we exist to serve. The second is trust. And I think, that's for me, what is so sad and troubling about the research findings is, even though as a sector we are trusted more than others, we are at risk of not being trusted by those we seek to serve, and we see it ourselves. And so, the more that we can invest in connection, build trust, center that in terms of what we're trying to do and how we do our work, I think that, it sounds very simple, but I think it's actually quite transformative.
Awesome.
And I would just say too, on that connection of on your comments around connection and trust, I also think about, related to that, how boards in this moment, we're seeing that boards are not diverse today. We know that 78% of board members are white, about 19% of boards do not have a single person of color. And I think there would be a greater investment, to your point around connection and trust, a greater investment in terms of individual board members really raising their knowledge and capacity around racial equity. Board members would be more likely to take training around race equity, to read articles, to listen to podcasts, to just raise their own awareness, particularly white board members for whom some of these issues, they just may not have thought about many of these issues because they haven't been as personal to them. They haven't been so relevant to their lived experiences as they've been to people of color. And so by raising their own capacity to talk about equity, and then also to then transfer that into how that applies to the work, I think we'd see just a greater focus and greater effectiveness among boards on issues related to diversity, inclusion, and equity.
Thank you. Thank you
Agreed.
for those answers and input. How significant is the shift from the current practices and ways in which nonprofit boards operate to the new mindset that the 4 principles of purpose-driven board leadership actually represent.
I can jump in there. And I see that we have a lot of questions, so I'll try and be really brief. I think it depends. I think that there are, and we know this because it informed the way that we thought about this, framework. There are boards that are operating this way today. There are boards that are really thinking about, deeply, what are we trying to do in the world and how do we do it? And how do we find partners who can help us do that? And how do we serve as good partners to others in the ways that we can? And how do we really center equity in terms of the work that we're doing? And how do we structure ourselves as a board so that we're very connected and sharing power in a way that we can feel very good about and that we know brings relevant insight and lived experience to the work that we're doing. So there are organizations that are doing this. That said, we also see that research, and we see that there are a lot of organizations who they themselves are saying they're very far away. And so, I think that really the invitation to each organization, and I see that we have a question about assessment, is really to ask yourselves, what would this mean for us? Is this us now? Do we recognize ourselves in this? How might we be different if we were to, lean into these 4 principles? How would our work be different? How would our board's composition be different? How would, this particular strategic conversation be different? So I would hesitate to say, we're here and we need to be here, except, in the way that sort of cites the research, because it's a very, very broad spectrum. But I think all of us as organizations have opportunities to ask ourselves, what's next for us? How do we get closer? How do we get more connected? How do we continue to earn that trust?
Andy, Jim, do either of you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. And thinking about, I'm just thinking a lot about what Jim said, and this doesn't speak directly to this question, but I think it's an overarching kind of concept and breaking down these barriers to equity, particularly for white board members. I know that we've heard this some, and I've had conversations with white board leaders, and myself included, being a white male. I try to own my fragility in every space that I can. And just understand when I feel like I'm being criticized or attacked or whatever. And one of the things that kind of, I've seen and I've had conversations with is kind of how dare you tell this board about its composition that they don't want to do the most good? Because they do. You are undermining our intentions. We want to help. We are here because we care about this community. We care about the work that this organization's doing, and we want to do the most amount of good. But if you don't have, like we talked about, the perspective of the community that you're serving, and you have a deep understanding of and knowledge of the problems that the organization is trying to solve, and then throwing good intentions or money or the way we've always done it is not enough. And we've heard folks for a long time, and like Ann said at the top, we love boards. We're BoardSource. We stand for boards, and we want boards to be able to do the most amount of good. But I don't think that anybody on this call from BoardSource would tell you that there's not a fundamental problem with the way boards have historically operated. And it's because good intentions and money have been the solution to solve all problems. And that, we know, is no longer the case. And we're chasing our tails going after the money and folks with good intentions instead of trying to solve the right problems.
Great. Well, I really actually want to open it up. I know there have been a couple of comments here. We have about 9 questions that are juicy. So would love to just at least have one of the panelists just respond as we walk through, and quick additions if you have. So I'm just going to start from, there's a question from Lloyd. Gardner, is the board mindset on organizational issues and fundraising driven by directors, or does it reflect the ethos of most civic organizations, which focus mainly on addressing specific community needs rather than systemic issues at the level of the whole society? Anybody want to take a step?
So I think that's a super interesting question, Lloyd. You know, I don't know that I would say that it's either or based on what we see, you know, from the BoardSource vantage point. But I think what you're pointing to is that many organizations are not thinking deeply about why we exist, and instead are focused on what we have said that we do. And that is not us saying that the only approach is a systems approach and that there is not value and import for direct service work, because there absolutely is. But one of the reasons that we sequenced the principles in the way that we did is because that purpose before organization and that idea of purpose first really is about going deep into the question of why do we exist and what do we exist to do, and what's the problem or the challenge or the state that we seek to address or solve. And that asking those deeper questions can open up an understanding, not just about what might we do differently as an organization, but how are we connected to others who are working in similar spaces. So even if an organization itself isn't taking a systems approach, by taking a deep look at purpose, it may see its connections to others in the ecosystem in a way that sort of brings that systems thinking and awareness to the way that it sees its work, its purpose, and its connection to those other players. So I don't know that it's an either or. I think it's a really interesting question.
Awesome. Thank you. Next question is from Ann Gross. If we are focused on the ecosystem, does this lead to consolidation of nonprofits that are purpose driven? Thank you, Ann, for that question.
I'll start with that one. I think that's a great question. And I actually think that it could very well lead to consolidation, because organizations, again, thinking purpose first, not organization first, would be thinking about what's really the best thing for the societal outcomes that we want to achieve. And so there wouldn't necessarily be a bias toward what is it that we can do to maintain our standing? What is it that we can do to maintain our standing as a single entity? And so there might be consolidations, because you could have conversations between organizations, between boards that might recognize, you know, we can do more together than we can do separately. And with that, I would also say that if there were situations in which there were a consolidation or one organization ceased to exist in its current form, there wouldn't really be any sort of stigma attached to that. I think society would look at that as being, really, that's the best outcome. That is what's best for the constituency that's being served. And so, that also might entice organizations to think more about when consolidations might make the most sense, because they wouldn't be quite so worried about how it might be viewed, because it would just be viewed as being the right thing for the audience being served. So that's my take on that.
Yeah, I would just double click on that, or you know, sort of snaps. I think that purpose-driven board leadership doesn't mean that organizations would necessarily feel like consolidation or merger or partnership is the only way to operate, but it certainly creates openness to think in that way, in a way that might lead to more of that. And just a note, we BoardSource, together in partnership with some great experts in the field of strategic alliances and restructuring, have a whole bunch of resources on that very topic that are available for free at thepowerofpossibility.org. So if you're interested in more on the idea of sustained collaboration, there are some great free resources there.
Awesome, thank you. Our next question comes from Robert. Do you have a suggestion on ways our board can evaluate how well we're currently engaging in the 4 principles of being a purpose-driven board? For example, and I think you saw this around the assessment piece, is there an assessment tool of some sort focused on this analysis? But really, how can boards evaluate how well they're currently engaging in these 4 principles?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Robert. And I won't take it as a push for us to create an assessment, even though I will take it that way, because it is something that we have talked about internally in a way. It's a resource that we would like to create for the 4 organizations to be able to kind of, just think about and react to what are the conversations we're having in the boardroom and how do those map to these principles that we've talked about. So this is a little bit as an aside, but I have a draft manuscript that I need to complete reading today and send over to Anne, that we are putting a book out later this year, hopefully sometime midsummer, called Putting Purpose First. And it talks about nonprofit leaders, board members, and CEOs and senior staff's role in putting purpose first in an organization. And so we are trying to get these topics to be easier to talk about in the boardroom, to be very translatable to board conversations, so the board can get up to speed on what the things that they can evaluate about the conversations that they're having. I would say, I always am a big fan of board meeting assessments after board meetings, so the board can engage in how well did this meeting go from a variety of angles, but to start to build in questions about purpose-driven board leadership and how you are shifting the traditional frame that you've had as a board, asking your board, are we doing enough to not be the way we've always been? Are we having the right conversations for the priorities we've put in place for ourselves and how we're shifting? So that is a long way to say, we don't have a resource or tool today, but we hope to have some soon. But there are a lot of ways that boards can build in new conversations or evaluations of how they're meeting. But Jim and Anne, if you've got other thoughts or ideas, I'd love to hear them.
I think that was great.
Good. And be on the lookout for that book, hopefully later this summer.
Thank you, Andy. We have another one from Pat. I've been working in this space for the last 4 years, helping organizations evolve, yet their boards are largely white and raise money. Any evolution steps?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that from my perspective, and I think this is kind of the power, or one of the things that is powerful about purpose-driven board leadership, is it is not a digital shift. So boards can slowly, incrementally lean into a commitment to being purpose-driven. So on, the question of board composition, sort of explicitly, I think having a conversation that asks questions about, what do we not understand? What do we not know? Where are we not trusted? What are we missing in terms of perspective, and understanding sort of what's the price that we're paying for the way that we are currently operating or the way that we are currently populated, and what would it take to change? And then using that as a platform for a different way of thinking about board recruitment, so that you're not rushing to, sort of, and I say this not to be in any way dismissive, but sort of recruitment focused on diversity that is not built on a foundation of understanding by the existing board, why is it that we need to be more diverse? And starting with those conversations that acknowledge what's the price that we're paying by not being.
Thank you, Anne.
Yeah, and if I could just add to what Anne just said, and once boards have had that conversation about why diversity matters, then when they go out to recruit people of color to be on their boards, they should make sure that when they recruit people of color, that they are able to express why it is they want them to join. It can't just be about filling a chair. It can't just be about sort of a token move to be able to say, well, we're more diverse now. We've checked the box. We can move on. It's got to be founded, as Anne was saying, founded on more than that. Founded on why it matters, why it will make them better, why it will make them more effective in serving their mission.
Great, thank you both. Kate joined us and asked, I'm especially intrigued with the question of orienting to the ecosystem. For boards that have been laser focused on protecting the organization's interests rather than the broader network, how would you introduce and move this forward?
Great question, Kate. And hi. So I don't know that there's one way to do this, but I think that, this could be a particularly interesting place to talk with the board about, if this were our MO, what would we do? So if we were focused on ourselves, what would we do? If we were focused on ecosystem, what would we do? And then sort of reconcile those two options, or those options that are brainstormed under those two categories, and ask the board itself to make sense of the sort of delta between those sets of options. And that might be, without saying we have to do it this way, or we're only going to consider options that are, it's a way to build muscle for the board around what does a different frame on the way that we're prioritizing things, or the way that we're deliberating, look like. And the hope would be that over time, whether in that conversation on its own or in future conversations and deliberations, the board would start to see the value of considering ecosystem, and that in combination with purpose first thinking, or purpose versus organization thinking, would free up a sense of, this feels like the right decision, but I thought my responsibility was to, only think about our organization, and to help the board move with comfort into a broader way of thinking about impact and prioritization. That's what comes to my mind. But Andy, Jim, anything you would add?
I think that's great. And yeah, we appreciate the question, Kate, and Propel Nonprofits' relationship with us on the powerofpossibility.org that Ann was just speaking of.
Awesome. Our next question comes from Donna. Competition for scarce resources is very real and not going away anytime soon. Thus, more than a change in mindset is needed to achieve greater collaboration and cooperation across nonprofits. What, other than a change in mindset, is needed to achieve greater collaboration here?
I've got a lot of thoughts, and a lot of them are, you say what other than a change of mindset, and I'm going to, maybe this is a cheap way to take out of this. I'm assuming when you say a change in mindset, you are discussing a change in mindset on your board and how your board operates and discusses. Well, it also takes a change in mindset from all the different players in our ecosystem, like funders and folks in philanthropy. And I'm just going to throw this out there, but on, now I'm going to botch the date. So Ann, Jim, Keita, help remind me. We are doing a webinar in partnership with the Center for Effective Philanthropy on May 13th. May 13th. That if you'd like to join to talk about, this conversation from a philanthropy perspective, but it's not just, so a lot of the different levers that we've traditionally pulled in the nonprofit sector to make change have to also be having these same conversations. And when we talked about the power of possibility and we put that together, there is a line in one of those discussion guides that says that trust doesn't happen in the abstract. Trust happens when people are in the room having conversations with each other about what's possible. So when we talk about kind of a change in mindset that does need to come first, I would start saying, we have to make incremental steps forward to move out of the traditional ways we've done things. We can't just have another board meeting that has a few different items on the agenda. It is reaching out to new, people who are from within and a part of the community that we represent in a part and parcel of this ecosystem. It is starting to have conversations with other nonprofits and building trust around what is possible, anywhere from backroom collaborations to full-blown mergers, like the question we had about, do purpose-driven boards start to collaborate in a way that we see less organizations? So it is actually putting this mindset into action. And you have to do that sometimes before you're all even comfortable with the new mindset, to start saying, we're going to put our toe not just in the water, we're going to jump all the way in here and start having a little bit of faith.
Yeah, I would just add, and this is again at the risk of oversimplifying, when I think about boards, I think it's sort of a jambalaya of who the people are, what the mindset of those individuals are and the sort of mindset of the board as a collective, and what practices they have in place, practices and systems they have in place. And all three of those categories are really important. But I would argue the mindsets are, in fact, the most important. And so a lot of board change really does start with mindset change. And that's particularly because the structure, the way that power is structured for boards is that, boards have to change themselves. There are very few external influences that, can't be ignored. And so boards do have to think about how they want to change themselves. And so that mindset does become, I would argue, most important for most board change.
Thank you. So from, forgive me for the name, Char, forgive me, for many nonprofits, the board's fundraising is critical to survival. If the board shifts away from fundraising toward purpose, does the organization need to find other funding?
So I'll jump in there. We're actually not arguing for a shift away from fundraising. So, this is not an either or for us. So we're not, and I think I may have said this before, we're not arguing that the board doesn't have a role to play in fundraising. We're certainly not arguing that organizations don't need fundraising to exist. We're pro fundraising as an organization because we know that it's the lifeblood, on which organizations do their important work. What we're trying to say in purpose-driven board leadership and lots of other things that we've said as an organization is, when you construct your board in a way that is based solely on its ability to fundraise, you are paying a price that is too high a price to pay. And so, having board members on the board who are there because they have a lot to offer in terms of fundraising, they've got, wonderful networks of wealth, that's a great thing. That's wonderful. The challenge is when that is the only profile that you have around the board, and you've set yourselves up to be able to do fundraising and nothing else. And so, I realize that I'm sort of painting with a broad brush, but we would argue that the beauty of boards is that you don't have to choose. You actually can have a strategically populated board that, through a strategic combination of people that are sitting around the board table and doing the board's work, enable you to have all of the things that you need in terms of strategy, insight, perspective, networks of influence, networks from a fundraising perspective. So it's not an either or.
Awesome, thank you for that. Cynthia shares, you refer to a changing world that requires a purposeful response. What are the elements of some of those societal and organizational changes you are referring to?
So I'm happy to weigh in there, but Jim and Andy, I've been talking a lot if you have thoughts.
Sure. Well, I mean, and Jim, I'd like to open this up to you, because you think about our sector leadership initiatives and all the problems we're trying to tackle. But I would also say, I would imagine that the 100 or 115 or so that were on this call have and the purposes they operate within and the communities they operate within would all have very similar yet very different answers to this question. And when we think about ourselves as a national organization who is assisting the entire sector or trying to speak to nonprofit boards about their purpose, that this answer, there is a micro and there is a macro, but Jim, I'll let you take it from there. But I know that we've got a lot of folks working on a lot of issues in a lot of different communities that all are extremely passionate.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Andy. When we think about the concept of inequity right now in our society, there are so many areas where it manifests itself. Think about the racial wealth gap. The gap in terms of access to affordable housing, gaps around education, health issues, health outcomes, criminal justice, the environment. There are lots of environmental implications to lots of issues related to how people of color are at a disadvantage as it relates to environmental decisions that are being made. There are just so many ways, access to jobs, to well-paying jobs, all these different things in terms of employment that relate to the various missions of the organizations that we serve, in terms of helping organizations to have the leadership they need to advance their missions, to fulfill their missions and advance the public good. And the public good is all of us. It has to be about everyone being involved, being engaged, and having access to opportunity. I think about the missions probably of all of you all on this call today. And when we think about equity, it's about access to opportunity for people who have been historically underserved in some aspect, some mission that your particular organization may be serving. And so that's why this work is so important. This conversation around purpose rather than organization, because frankly, the scope of the issues that we're seeing in society are such that organizations in and of themselves, we won't be able to handle these issues just alone. The opportunity for partnership, for collaboration, for sharing resources, for ways in which we can complement each other in terms of addressing these issues, those things are just, we have to think that way if we're going to be successful in trying to bridge the divides we see and reduce the inequities that are being manifested right now in our society. So that's where I would come from on that particular question.
Awesome, thank
Yeah,
you.
and I would just go back real quickly. I totally agree with what's been shared, and within that context of increasing inequity, we also are in a context of declining trust. And if you think about the combination of those two things and what it means to be a social sector organization and what it's not only requires today, but is going to require from social sector organizations to regain, rebuild, or sort of reinvest in trust so that we can be part of positive impact, positive growth, decreasing inequity. We need to think about what that is calling on us to do in terms of our own power structures. And that, I think, is sort of fundamentally what purpose-driven board leadership is about.
Awesome. We have two final questions. So if one panelist can answer each one, that would be fabulous. Cynthia asked, can you provide specific examples of focusing on the public the organization serves versus focusing on the organization? I ask this because this is assuming the org is not focused on its public.
Yeah, so we don't assume that the org is not focused on its public. And the hope is that in most decisions, the needs of the public or the positive impact on the public or the community served also serves the organization. And in fact, there are lots of examples of cases where that's true. But as you heard Andy talk about, there are those moments where it's not one and the same. And what is good for the community served is not necessarily what is best, at least in a narrowly defined definition of organization, or best for organization, narrowly defined. So the example of, the public service campaign around vaccines, there might be times where, it would be great to get organizational attention for something, but that is a distraction from something else. There might be times where an organization is saying, this investment that would be required here is, something that we would rather put here in terms of what our organization needs, but this is a really acute community need, and we need to follow the community. And, I would also say that we don't assume that this is not sort of like a checklist of, if you are trying to be purpose-driven, you always must do this. It's more a way of deliberating and framing the questions that you are asking yourselves as a board, and not making the assumption that what is best for organization is always what's best.
All right, we have one last question, quick rapid fire. Do you see the purpose of most private or not-for-profit schools fitting into the purpose-driven paradigm? If yes, how? If no, why not?
I can take
And
that one if no,
I
but
was gonna say, and
Andy,
as
did
a-
you
as
want
a-
to?
No, I was just gonna say, as a former board chair in a school, you probably have unique perspective on this.
Yeah, I mean, short answer, yes, I do. But I think that you know that every entity has to ask themselves, and every board of an entity has to ask themselves, who's our public? What's the reason that we exist? You know, sort of what's our core purpose as an organization? And you know, that might lead to some different framing around, you know, what is it that we're here to do, that might shape the way that the organization sees, you know, sort of its reason for being. And that's not me saying it should be this way, but simply, you know, if you're existing in service to educating young minds, that's a frame on the way that you see your work that might be different than a way that a board has been talking about, how do we increase enrollment? Those might be leading to the same thing, but they might not. And so, you know, I think that there's value in asking the questions from a different angle and seeing what that brings up for your organization.
Awesome. Well, thank you to everybody. Thank all of the participants for your questions, very engaging. Thank you to all of our panelists. So as we wrap up today, I hope that you've had an opportunity to gain a better and stronger understanding of purpose-driven board leadership and our principles. We hope that you will lean in, ask the hard questions. We truly invite you to do that. I would like to thank our panelists, Ann Walstead, Jim Taylor, Andy Davis, for leading us through this deep dive. And again, thanks everyone for who joined us. I encourage all of you to read the article, share it, consider its applicability to your work day in and day out. And we hope you'll again share it with your networks, and maybe we'll see you on May 13th at our next one with a focus on foundations. So again, thank you for joining us and have a wonderful afternoon.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.